Right, well, first of all, I want to say thank you very much for having me along to this event. I'm just going to give you a little anecdote before I start. I was at a very big national summit at Westminster on Thursday, talking about something entirely different, but it was a big health summit. And they had a session on the future of town centres and on health contributing to the future of town centres in terms of health and well-being. I went along to listen to that session. There were several ministers there. There were 300, 400 people in the room. And at one point during the discussion, someone stood up and said, "You're talking to the wrong people. I don't want to hear from experts. I don't want to hear from ministers. I want to hear from the people that are actually involved and live in the communities that are affected by town centres that are struggling." And I had great pleasure in standing up and saying, I'm going at the weekend to Dudley to do exactly that and be involved in a people's panel. And so I've been asked to report back after this session on how I felt it went. I was quite disappointed that the ministry, who were there, didn't acknowledge the funding that they've put into this process or even acknowledge that it was happening. So we'll do our best to make sure they find out. Anyway, before I get into what I'm going to talk about town centres, just a little bit about who I am. I work for a planning consultancy. I'm a town planner by profession. I spend quite a lot of my time working on regeneration projects, town centre projects, and the like. Got quite a long history in this patch. I was brought up here, but I've also worked here extensively in the past on both Brierley Hill and Dudley town centres. I'll come back to that a little bit more tomorrow. As a business, as a practice, the company I work for work all over the country. I've given you just a few here of the centres that we've worked on most recently. So I hope that I can bring a little bit of what's going on elsewhere. And certainly I can ask questions about what other centres are doing up and down the country. Start with the challenge. I'm not going to spend very long on this at all. You're all more than familiar with the problems that the high street is facing, the challenges that our high streets are facing. Some of them have already been mentioned this morning. Those stem from lifestyle, from competition, from the approach we take to discount retailing, planning policy, investment, rent, all the things that have been mentioned already. Internet shopping is the one that is always sort of bandied about most commonly at the moment. I think it's worth just touching on that one in particular. You probably can't read the figures on this little graph here, but round about where we are now, somewhere around 2017, 18, 19, we're sitting at about 17 to 20% of retailing is happening online. Next 10 years, by about 2028, the little graph says it'll be about 30%. So it's seriously on the increase. But 30%. 70% of it is not happening on the internet. 70% of it is still happening out there in the bricks and mortar. And that's important because I think we tend to overemphasize the growth of internet shopping as the reason for the demise in our town centres. I also want to highlight the fact that actually we've got a bit complacent and a bit lazy about our town centres. It's very easy to blame internet shopping, but there are a whole host of complicated reasons why it is happening and lots of things we could do things about. Some perfect examples here of the nature of the environment that we often find in smaller and medium-sized town centres up and down the country. It's all about quality and experience. That's what we go to town centres for. And when we find ourselves encountering this kind of environment, it's far from a pleasurable experience. So, the solution. I was going to go for a rugby shot or a Boris shot. I opted for the Boris shot. It's not Boris that's going to save the high streets. He can certainly throw some money at it, and it's very encouraging to hear how well you are doing in winning your fair share of that money. But it's the communities that need those high streets that are actually going to make the difference. And an awful lot of what I'm going to talk about now is about how those communities can input to that process and why they need to input to that process. So, we'll forget Boris for the moment. I'm going to give you 6 kind of things to think about over the next day and a half, which I think are probably the most important things that come out of our work in town centres in terms of making change. Know your place, define your purpose, reinforce your signature, which does sound a bit jargonistic. I'm going to come back to that one. Work the demographic, understand the people that are using your town centres. Hand stitch and curate. Again, I'll come back and explain what I mean about that. And then how do we make it happen? So, first of all, I want you to really think about what it is to be in a good town centre, what it offers and what it looks like. We've got completely obsessed in this country with shopping and what shopping means for our town centres. But town centres historically and town centres in the future will be about shopping. There's still 70% of it that's going to be need to accommodate in 2028. But it's about a whole host of other things. It's about gathering, it's about socialising, it's about interaction, it's about services. It's about virtually everything that you go looking for when you walk out of your front door. And that's where you've got to start. Put shopping to one side for the moment. The big retailers, the little retailers, the commercial businesses, they'll look after themselves. What do you want from your high street? It's complicated. Someone said it this morning. It's a really complex picture. You can't read this diagram. I hope maybe there's a copy of it that can find its way around. But we've kind of identified all the different things that go towards making a good centre. And it's not about shopping. It's about access. It's about creativity. It's about civic leadership. It's about public domain. It's about all of the services and facilities you need. And that's what you need to think about, really, as the starting point for what you want from Dudley and Brierley Hill. Those of us that work in centres help local authorities make their bids for money, help local authorities develop strategies, policies, the work we've done previously in Merry Hill, Brierley Hill and in Dudley. We use a lot of diagnostics, fancy word, we use a lot of data. We go really into the heart of what it means to be a good, well-functioning town centre. So we look at all the data about vacancy, about rental levels. We look at what's going on in terms of the mix. We look at the restrictions that planning policy places on those centres. And we use that as a kind of baseline for understanding where we're starting and where we want to be. Land use, mix is really important. Vacancy, it's been mentioned this morning, is important. But by the time you've got vacant shops, the problems are already really embedded and you've got to get there much earlier if you're going to sort the problem out. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about what we do when we're looking at centres, but I'm also going to reflect back on you, what you can think about and what you know from your knowledge and experience of these places. We work very closely with a number of organisations, one of which I've mentioned here, Springboard, on kind of analysing what makes town centres tick, what makes them work. We use about 130 different indicators that we can choose from when we're looking at centres to try and decide what state they're in, what health they're in, how vital, how vibrant they are. The most important of those, and the ones which all of you can think about, are footfall. Principally, it's about footfall, because people on the street are what matters to the vibrancy of the town centre. People on the street are what matters to the way that most of the uses and services and facilities that are available function and how well they function. So we increasingly use footfall as the main kind of indicator of the health of a centre. I just want you to think about how many people visit Brierley Hill and how many people visit Dudley. Where they arrive, where they get out their car, where they get off the bus, where they're heading for, what different things they do along the way, what different things they see along the way, because managing and manipulating that is how you really get a good, vibrant centre. A few little things to think about here. So it's about manipulating the football. That's how you change the nature and success of a centre. It's about feeding that footfall. It's all about people. Where are people coming from and where are people going to? How do you get more people into your centre? Residential is an important part of that and has been right at the heart of the strategy for Dudley and Brierley Hill for 20 or more years. Getting people living back in centres and on the edges of centres is really critical. But it's also about other major generators of town centre activity, about council offices, workplaces, hospitals, medical centres, all the things that will attract people into your centre. Where you put them and how you link them together and how people can move between them in a high quality environment, on foot, on cycle, and if necessary in their car, is how you create a vibrant centre as a starting point for looking ahead. In centres that are struggling, compacting your centre and concentrating that footfall is something really worth thinking about. Now that's quite challenging to actually do, but it's something you can work to over a long time. So if you've had a really vibrant centre functioning at quite a large scale, but things are getting a bit tired and a bit weary and competition is meaning that it's not as vibrant as it was, it may be that you want to bring all that retail back together in the core. You may want to let the retail go on the edges. You may want to bring other things into the core that mean you concentrate that footfall and give what you have got a better chance of surviving. If it is successful, it can always expand again. Town centres have always evolved. They've always flexed to need and demand. And so you must think just because you're taking something away or you're contracting or you're compacting at the moment, it doesn't mean it'll necessarily be like that in 5 or 10 years' time. There's new ways of thinking about how we classify town centres, and I want to just touch a little bit on this because I think it's quite helpful. We always used to classify town centres by their scale. You had a regional, you had a sub-regional, you had local centres, you had district centres, you had little high streets serving little local communities. It was all about size, and actually it was all about the size of the retailing. Now we tend to think about centres quite differently, and this is something that's evolved quite a lot in the last 5 to 10 years. We talk about their function primarily, going back to what I was saying earlier about thinking about what you want from your centre. We use a particular classification of centres that tends to lead you towards thinking about its primary role in the relationship to its users and its community. So we have conventional comparison centres, Merry Hill over the road there, definitely just purely, really a comparison centre, all about comparison shopping. You have speciality centres that are about a very special purpose, and I think Dudley and potentially Brierley Hill fall into that category. Multifunctional centres, which are very much about local convenience and sort of smaller scale mixed use. Holiday centres, centres at the seaside that you go and visit primarily as a holiday destination, have a very different profile. We call that a signature. And when we're looking at evolving town centre strategies, we try and use that signature as the starting point. There's a lot more complexity to this, but I think it's quite a helpful way of kind of capturing the point about don't just think about the shopping. When you understand what the centre is you've got and what you want it to be, I want it to be all about the local community. I want it to be about heritage, and I want it to be about visitors, or I want it to be about comparison shopping. You can start to look at how it then fits, how it compares to other centres of that type or complementary to that type, and you can look at how it sits in a hierarchy. We've been doing some work up in Lichfield, and the little diagram that you probably can't read up there sort of looks at the network of centres that are in and around that part of the Midlands, how they relate to Lichfield. You don't want 10 comparison centres on top of each other. You don't want 10 speciality centres on top of each other. You want to think about how they differentiate and how they compare and how they work alongside each other and work together. So when you've got that sort of baseline understanding, and there's a whole host of things you can do to get that understanding, you start to work the opportunity and think about what it means to evolve and develop that opportunity. Again, I can talk a little bit more about that perhaps in the questions if you want to understand what's going on in other centres, but I want to spend the little time I've got actually trying to get you a bit inspired about thinking what you've got on your doorstep. I'm going to talk about demographics just a little bit because I think it's really important and often overlooked. It's great to see quite a mix of demographics in terms of age in here, which is a really good starting point. Age is a big factor in all this and something that you must think about in looking ahead. I'm particularly going to concentrate on the Greys and the Gretas, the old people and the young people, because that's what it really matters in terms of the demographic profile of this country at the moment. Again, you probably can't see the graph, but you can probably pick out the big red lines. The big red lines are the change in population that's anticipated for the over 65s in the period to 2024, so that's just the next few years. So you can see that all the age cohorts, blues 0 to 15, yellows 16 to 64, they're all growing. Population's growing, you'd expect that. That age profile for the over 65 is growing massively. And I want you to think differently, probably, than you do right now about that age cohort and what it means for centres, services, needs and requirements. They've got time. Many of them are retired, many of them are partly retired, but most of them are still pretty active. And they are the ones that potentially really bring a new dimension to centres in the future. They're not little old ladies with Zimmer frames. They're not war veterans. They're people that are looking for opportunities for social interaction, looking for opportunities to do things, meet friends, find new and exciting things to do. There's a really good bit of work that Nuffield did on their health centres that discovered that I think it was their biggest age category for use of their gyms was 72-year-olds. We're just not catering for this need and this demand at the moment, and it's a huge demand that could revitalise 101 town centres up and down the country. I'm going to talk about the Gretas. These are the young people that are coming through their teens and into their 20s now. We did a bit of interesting work in my office where we asked all of our young people under 25s to think about what town centres are like now and what they might want from town centres in the future. They came up with some really interesting little diagrams. Again, you're not going to be able to see the details on these, but I'll invite you to have a look. This is all about conventional retailing, 2 department stores, some shops in between. This is all about experience. It's all about finding somewhere to meet your mates, somewhere to take a selfie, somewhere to go and buy some food in a plastic bag or a paper bag, even better. Different kind of retailing. It's about services. It's about pubs, grab and go, retailing that's not necessarily conventional, a bit quirky, a bit unusual. It's all those kind of things. I'm going too slow. I'm going to get in trouble. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way now. Again, they provided us with this little diagram, which I hope, again, we can share around. It kind of captures all of their ambitions for town centres in the future. And it's probably quite different to what you might expect from someone in that middle age cohort. So, experience, community, this is where we're heading. Coffee shops, really good example of the way things have changed over the last few years and will continue to change. We're just about to get to the point where there's more coffee shops than pubs in this country, and it's only going to get growing. Huge growth in this sector over the next few years. It's an indicator of what people are looking for from their centres. So, I'm going to just throw some pictures at you because I think it's a really good way of inspiring you to think a bit differently about centres. What Amazon can't do is a really good one I got from one of the youngsters in the office. Really good way of thinking about what you might have on your high street, because what Amazon can't do is what you want on your high street. And that's all sorts of things. They can't take your trousers up for you. They can't ice a cake. They can't give you a massage. They can't do your nails. They can't prune your poodle. Those are the things that you've got to think about differently in the future. And there's all sorts of examples on these sheets. You know, yeah, you can go and pick your internet shopping up, but you can go to a tea dance on the street, get your coffee, get your poodle pruned, go for some physiotherapy. These are the things that are going to be on our high street in 10, 15 years' time. Loads of them on here. Take a little look at the slides. My point about hand stitching and curating is it's really not going to help you to look at what's going on in the next town centre. You need to look into your communities and think about what you can bring to the high street from those local communities. The domination of retailing over the last 20 or 30 years has driven out lots of little small individual businesses, the hobby retailers, the people doing physiotherapy, the people teaching kids to read. All of those services are now happening in back bedrooms and garages or on the edge of industrial estates. All of those things could be back in the town centre if we provide the right space for it to happen. And those are the things that will start to bring the people back. That means the footfall increases. That means you can start talking about linked journeys to do different things in town centres, not just shopping. Again, I can talk about some of the examples of this. A few things to think about. Shared space is a really important aspect of this. Convergence, we call it in the business, bringing different things into the same unit. So you can listen to some music while you're having a cup of coffee. In the same space, you can buy a book, or you can buy a record, or you can look at some antique jewellery. These things are the ways of getting smaller businesses back into our centres. And it needs investment and time and energy, and it needs local people to drive that and look at what the opportunities are around them. You've got a great market in Brierley Hill. You probably don't even think you need to touch that. But what are the other things that could be in that market that would make it a little bit more diverse? What about a bar in the middle of it? Been to a great example of that somewhere else. Last couple of slides. Go as quick as I can, sorry. It was mentioned this morning, really good question. How do you make sure you don't waste your money? There's been some really good work done around this on how you actually focus the money you've got. And again, you won't be able to read this slide, but what it basically is about is looking at the things that have the greatest impact and over which you have the greatest control. So there's a whole load of indicators on here which are all about the vitality of centres. And what it basically tells you is this one here might be really important, but if you've not got any control over it, leave it for now. Go and do the things that really matter and that you can take control of. Start there and then work your way down the rest of the list. Again, happy to give a little bit more detail on that. Wrong way again, sorry. Finally, this is about taking control, and this is where I'm going to challenge the council officers that are still in the room. Councils are now doing more than just managing the money and bringing it in and feeding it through and dealing with the planning and the licensing and everything else that goes on around centres. They're now getting stuck into being investors. Several authorities in this country are doing that in their town centres. Great research that's just established that actually nearly 70% of all shopping centre investment in the first quarter of 2018, 255 million, was by councils wanting to get into their centres and take control. And when they take control, they can start doing some of the things that means you can get some of the more unusual things back into your town centres. Housing delivery. Again, councils, lots of them getting stuck into housing delivery and adding a further dimension to that important part of town centre regeneration. I'm being waved at, so I'm going to stop. Obviously, you're doing a really good job getting your funding, but think very carefully about how that funding is used to bring back use and vitality and bring back activity, not just bring about the things that we all know are necessary in terms of quality of space and place. I'm out of time. Thank you very much.